Before Pokemon became the series we know today, it began with a rough prototype built on borrowed tools, unfinished ideas, and experiments that quietly shaped the entire franchise. Tonight, we'll explore how the games grew from those early sketches into the world millions of players now recognize. You'll hear about the programming trick that allowed Kanto and Johto to fit together in a single cartridge, the strange quirk that kept missing. No preserved inside the code, and the early systems that determined how critical hits were calculated in red and blue. Some details reveal how Pokeballs borrowed inspiration from old capsule toy machines, while others trace how certain mechanics emerged from strict hardware limits. In the first prototype that Game Freak assembled in the early 1990s, the original concept for Pokemon was described as a world where creatures could be collected and connected through cables, a simple idea that sounds almost obvious now, but represented something revolutionary at the time. Portable gaming in those days was mostly about short, isolated experiences, games that you played alone on a small gray screen during car rides or waiting rooms. The Game Boy's link cable had existed for years, but it was primarily used for competitive head-to-head matches in games like Tetris, where players tried to outlast each other. Pokemon reimagined the cable as something entirely different, a tool for cooperation, exchange, and friendship rather than competition. This subtle shift in how players interacted with each other laid the foundation for one of the most social gaming experiences of its generation, turning the link cable from a novelty into something essential, and it lingers softly in the background of the series. And before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. One of the very first creatures designed for the series was the small balloon-like creature that would eventually become Clefairy, and it was originally used in test builds to check how the Game Boy could handle movement and battle animations. Clefairy's simple round design made it an ideal candidate for early experimentation, allowing the developers to test scaling, attack frames, and movement patterns without worrying about complex visual details. What began as a placeholder experiment quickly turned into one of the most iconic early species, and Clefairy was even considered as the franchise's official mascot before Pikachu was ultimately chosen. The developers found that Clefairy's gentle, approachable design resonated with test audiences, especially younger players who were drawn to its soft, fairy-like appearance. There's a quiet charm in knowing that this beloved creature started as nothing more than a technical test, a simple shape moving across a monochrome screen to help programmers understand the limits of the hardware. The name Pokémon itself was not the original title of the project, and in its earliest conceptual form, it was actually called Capsule Monsters, a name that reflected the cultural inspiration behind the entire catching mechanic. Capsule toy vending machines were extremely popular in Japan during the 1980s and 90s, simple machines where children could insert coins and receive small collectible figures sealed inside plastic spheres. The thrill of not knowing what you'd get until you cracked open the capsule was a central part of the experience, and this same anticipation was woven directly into the design of the Pokeball. The developers wanted to recreate that same feeling of surprise and discovery, the moment when you open something small and find out what treasure was hidden inside. This cultural phenomenon shaped not just the mechanics of catching Pokemon, but the entire philosophy of collection and surprise that defines the series, and it leaves a quiet impression once you notice it, reminding us that even the most iconic elements of the games have roots in everyday experiences from Japanese culture. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we find ourselves looking at the technical challenges faced during the programming of the very first games, where memory limitations on the Game Boy cartridge forced the development team to be incredibly resourceful with every byte of data. Multiple species, such as Raiden, Gengar, and Kangaskhan, shared recycled sound cries that were only slightly pitched up or down to create the illusion of uniqueness. These reused audio files allowed the developers to fit more creatures into the cartridge, while still giving each one what felt like a distinct identity. Many fans never realized that their favorite Pokemon cries were actually variations of the same short sound clip, altered just enough to sound different to the untrained ear. It's a testament to the creativity and technical skill of the development team, who managed to create an entire world of creatures within the severe constraints of 1990s handheld technology. The fact that these limitations are almost invisible to players speaks to how well the illusion was crafted, and it settles quietly in the atmosphere of the early games, a hidden layer of ingenuity that most players never noticed. The towns in the Kanto region were named after colors, a subtle thematic choice that unified the entire map under a single creative concept. Palette Town represented the blank artist's palette, the starting point where the player's journey would begin with no colors yet chosen, no path yet decided. Other locations like Lavender Town, Cerulean City, and Vermilion City carried names linked directly to specific shades of color, each one evoking a particular mood or feeling. This design choice gave a simple but elegant unifying theme to the geography, one that tied into the larger creative idea of painting your own adventure from a blank start. The developers wanted the journey to feel like a work of art in progress, with each new town representing a new color added to the palette. It's the kind of detail that's easy to overlook, but becomes quietly meaningful once you recognize the pattern, and it drifts softly through the background of the Kanto experience, adding a layer of artistic intention to what might otherwise feel like random naming choices. There's a curious detail about how critical hits were calculated in the earliest games, and instead of being tied to individual moves or random chance in the way later generations would implement them, critical hits were actually determined by the speed stat of each Pokémon. This meant that fast creatures like Jolteon or Persian had a dramatically higher chance of landing critical hits compared to slower, bulkier species like Snorlax or Golem. The formula created some interesting balance problems in competitive play, as speed became disproportionately valuable, not just for moving first, but also for dealing unexpected bursts of damage. At the same time, it made battles feel more unpredictable and dynamic, since a single fast strike from a speedy Pokémon could completely turn the tide of a difficult encounter. Developers later revised this system in subsequent generations to create more balanced gameplay, but there's something nostalgic about the original implementation, where speed was king and battles could shift dramatically with a single lucky blow. Slowly, the story widens as we consider how the fossil mechanic was directly inspired by Japan's cultural fascination with paleontology and the idea of bringing extinct creatures back to life. Fossil Pokémon like Kabuto, Omanite, and later Aerodactyl reflected a deep sense of wonder about ancient history and the possibility of reviving long-extinct species from preserved remains. The developers included this feature to give players the sense that the world of Pokémon had existed for millions of years, long before the events of the game they were currently playing. It added an unexpected layer of depth to the setting, suggesting that there were entire eras of history that predated human civilization, times when different species ruled the world in ways that are now only glimpsed through fossils. This sense of deep time made the Pokémon world feel larger and more mysterious, as if every region held secrets buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The revival process itself, taking a fossil to a laboratory and watching scientists bring it back to life, created a bridge between the ancient past and the present moment, and it leaves a lingering sense of awe when you think about the scope of history implied by these small game mechanics. Another quirky fact about the early games involves the very first rival character, known as Blue in the English versions and Green in Japan, who was deliberately written as a smug and challenging counterpart to the player. He was designed to always pick the starter Pokemon that had a type advantage over yours, ensuring that his team would be a constant threat throughout the entire journey. Developers admitted in later interviews that they wanted children to feel a special satisfaction every time they defeated him, which meant making him intentionally irritating and overconfident in his dialogue. The rival was crafted to represent the idea of healthy competition, someone who pushed you to become stronger while also giving you someone to root against. This dynamic became a template for rival characters in future games, though later rivals would often be written with more friendly or supportive personalities. There's something memorable about Blue's aggressive confidence, the way he always seemed one step ahead and never missed an opportunity to remind you of it, and it lingers as one of the most iconic rivalries in the entire series. The introduction of shiny Pokemon in the Johto generation represented a major turning point in how players approached the games, adding a layer of rarity and collectability that went beyond simply filling the Pokédex. To ensure that every child experienced the thrill of encountering a shiny, the developers placed a guaranteed encounter with a red-colored Gyarados at the Lake of Rage, making it impossible to miss. This moment became one of the most unforgettable events in the series, demonstrating that Pokemon could exist in unique alternate colors and sparking countless hours of hunting for other shinies in the wild. Many fans remember this encounter as their very first shiny Pokemon, a vivid red Gyarados that stood out dramatically against the usual blue coloration. The fact that shinies were introduced with such a memorable scripted event helped cement their importance in the series, turning them from a hidden curiosity into a central part of Pokemon culture. The odds of encountering a shiny randomly in the wild were set at 1 in 8,192, a number so rare that some players went years without ever seeing one outside of the guaranteed Lake of Rage encounter, and it drifts quietly through the memories of countless players who spent hours soft resetting for that perfect shiny starter. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's worth reflecting on how the very first Pokémon movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back, became such a significant cultural event in Japan that schools actually reported lower attendance on its opening day. Children across the country convinced their parents to let them skip school so they could be among the first to see the film, creating a phenomenon that extended far beyond typical movie releases. The film explored surprisingly mature themes for a children's property, dealing with questions of identity, purpose, and what it means to be born into a world that sees you as nothing more than a weapon. Mewtwo's existential crisis resonated with audiences of all ages, creating an emotional depth that elevated the movie beyond simple entertainment. The climactic scene where Pokemon fought against their clones while Ash tried desperately to stop the violence became one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the franchise, and many viewers remember crying in theaters as the conflict unfolded. The movie proved that Pokemon could tell stories with real emotional weight, stories that stayed with viewers long after the credits rolled, and it settles quietly in the history of the franchise as a turning point that showed the series could grow beyond its origins as a simple collecting game. The design of Pikachu itself went through several iterations before arriving at the iconic yellow mouse we know today, and early concept art shows a much rounder, almost blob-like creature that looked quite different from the final design. Ken Sugimori, the lead character designer, gradually refined Pikachu's proportions to make it cuter and more appealing, elongating the ears, adjusting the body shape, and perfecting the placement of the red cheek pouches that would become one of its most recognizable features. The anime further refined Pikachu's design, making it slightly slimmer and more expressive to work better in animation, and this version of Pikachu eventually became the standard that even the games would adopt in later generations. There's something fascinating about how a character's design can evolve and improve through iteration, each version building on what came before until you arrive at something that feels absolutely perfect and timeless. Pikachu's journey from rough concept sketch to global icon mirrors the franchise's own evolution from a small Game Boy game to one of the most recognizable brands in entertainment history. Another detail that often goes unnoticed is how the movie metronome was programmed in the original games, where it could randomly select from nearly every move in the entire game, leading to completely unpredictable and sometimes hilarious results during battles. A Clefairy using metronome might unleash a devastating hyper beam, or it might simply use splash and accomplish nothing at all, and this randomness made metronome one of the most entertaining moves in casual play. The move was inspired by the unpredictability of a metronome's swinging arm, where you never quite know where it will stop, and it translated that same sense of anticipation into battle mechanics. Developers included moves like this to add an element of chaos and fun to battles, reminding players that not every strategy needed to be perfectly calculated and competitive. There's a quiet joy in watching a seemingly weak Pokémon use metronome and accidentally summon something completely overpowered, turning the tide of battle through pure chance, and it leaves a playful impression that reflects the more lighthearted side of the series. The concept of Pokémon breeding was introduced in the Johto games as a way to give players more control over their teams, allowing them to hatch eggs and potentially pass down moves, stats, and other traits from parent Pokémon to their offspring. This system added a completely new layer of depth to team building, especially for players interested in competitive battling who wanted to create Pokémon with specific movesets and optimal individual values. The daycare centers where breeding took place were presented as peaceful, pastoral locations where Pokémon could relax and form bonds with each other, and the game left the actual mechanics of reproduction somewhat vague and family-friendly. Discovering that two compatible Pokémon left at the daycare would eventually produce an egg became one of those quiet revelations that opened up entirely new possibilities for how players approached the games. The breeding system would continue to evolve in subsequent generations, becoming increasingly sophisticated with the introduction of abilities, natures, and hidden stats. But the core concept established in Johto remained fundamentally the same, and it drifts through the series as one of the most significant mechanical additions to the franchise. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, small details that accumulate over years of playing and replaying these games until they become part of our personal memories of childhood or adolescence. The Pokémon world is filled with these gentle touches, design choices, and mechanical systems that reveal themselves slowly over time rather than announcing themselves loudly. It's part of what makes the series so endlessly replayable, the knowledge that there's always something new to discover or rediscover, some detail you missed the first time, through that suddenly becomes apparent on your 5th or 10th playthrough. The games reward patience and curiosity, encouraging players to talk to every NPC, explore every corner of every town, and experiment with different team compositions and strategies. This philosophy of slow, gentle discovery extends from the smallest details, like hidden items tucked behind trees, all the way up to major legendary encounters that require specific conditions to trigger. The legendary beasts of Johto, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune were designed to roam randomly across the entire region, creating a sense that these powerful creatures existed independently of the player's journey, living their own lives in the world. Encountering one of these roaming legends required patience, luck, and strategic use of the Pokédex's location tracking feature to narrow down where they might appear next. The roaming mechanic made these Pokémon feel genuinely wild and untamed, refusing to wait passively in a single location for the player to arrive. Each encounter lasted only a single turn before the legend would flee, forcing players to either trap them with status moves or weaken them gradually across multiple encounters before finally attempting to catch them. This cat and mouse dynamic created some of the most memorable hunting experiences in the series, where finally cornering and capturing a roaming legend after hours of pursuit felt like a genuine achievement. The fact that these beasts were tied to the lore of the Burn Tower and Ho-Oh added mythological weight to their existence, suggesting that they were reborn from the ashes of Pokémon who perished in the tower's destruction centuries ago. Before we continue this gentle journey, it's worth reflecting on how the music of Pokémon has always played a crucial role in creating the emotional atmosphere of each region and moment. Junichi Masuda, who composed much of the original soundtrack, understood that music needed to enhance the sense of adventure without overwhelming the player or becoming annoying during long play sessions. Routes featured upbeat, walking tempo melodies that made travel feel pleasant and relaxing, while caves and dungeons used more mysterious, echoing tones to create a sense of depth and hidden danger. Town themes were crafted to reflect the personality of each location, from the peaceful simplicity of Pallet Town's melody to the haunting minor key progression of Lavender Town's theme that unsettled an entire generation of players. The Lavender Town music became so infamous for its eerie quality that urban legends sprang up, claiming it caused headaches or negative psychological effects, though these stories were exaggerated products of internet folklore. Still, the fact that a simple Game Boy tune could create such a strong emotional response speaks to Masuda's skill as a composer and his understanding of how music shapes our experience of virtual spaces. The Pokémon storage system, represented in the games by various professors and characters depending on the generation, was a clever solution to the technical limitation of how many Pokémon a player could carry in their party at once. The original games allowed 6 Pokémon in the active party, with additional captures automatically sent to a PC storage system that could hold boxes of 30 Pokémon each. This system encouraged players to catch everything they encountered without worrying about running out of space, supporting the core gotta catch 'em all philosophy of the series. The act of organizing your boxes, sorting a Pokémon by type or level or evolution stage, became its own kind of soothing gameplay loop for many players, a quiet moment of reflection between more intense battles and story events. Later generations would improve and expand the storage system, eventually allowing players to access their boxes from almost anywhere, rather than requiring a trip back to a Pokémon Center. But the fundamental concept remained rooted in those early technical limitations that shaped how we interacted with our collections. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how the friendship and happiness mechanics were implemented in the Johto games, introducing the idea that Pokémon could form emotional bonds with their trainers that affected gameplay in tangible ways. Certain Pokémon like Golbat and Chansey required high friendship to evolve into Crobat and Blissey, encouraging players to actively use these Pokémon in their teams, give them vitamins and grooming items, and avoid letting them faint in battle. The friendship system added a layer of emotional connection to team building, suggesting that success came not just from having powerful Pokémon, but from forming genuine bonds with your partners. The return and frustration moves scaled in power based on friendship levels, becoming incredibly strong with maximum friendship or maximum unfriendliness, respectively, creating interesting strategic considerations around how you treated different Pokemon. This system would be refined and expanded in future generations, but its introduction in Johto marked an important philosophical shift toward acknowledging the emotional relationships between trainers and Pokemon as a core part of the experience. The concept of held items was another major innovation introduced in the Johto games, allowing Pokemon to hold berries, type-boosting items, evolution stones, or other objects that could affect battles or enable new evolutions. This simple addition opened up countless new strategic possibilities, from using leftovers to slowly heal a defensive Pokemon each turn to equipping Choice Band for devastating but locked-in attacks. Berries added a self-care element to longer journeys, allowing Pokemon to automatically heal status conditions or restore health during battle without requiring the player to use items from their bag. The held item system would become increasingly complex in later generations, with items that boosted specific stats, activated under certain conditions, or enabled completely new battle mechanics, but the foundation established in Johto remained an essential to how competitive battling evolved. There's something satisfying about the tactical depth that held items provided, turning seemingly simple decisions about what item to equip into meaningful strategic choices that could determine the outcome of challenging battles. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we encounter the mysterious ruins scattered across the Johto region, ancient structures filled with unknown and hidden messages that hinted at civilizations that existed long before the present day. The ruins of Alph were designed as archaeological sites where players could encounter the 28 different forms of unknown, each one shaped like a letter of the alphabet or a punctuation mark. Solving the slide puzzles hidden in the ruins would cause Unknown to appear in the connecting chambers, and collecting all the forms became an obsessive goal for co-completionists. The ruins themselves contained hidden messages written in unknown script that spelled out words like escape and light, adding to the sense of mystery and suggesting that these ancient structures held secrets that were never fully explained. The presence of these ruins in Johto connected the region to a deeper, older history, one that predated modern Pokemon training and hinted at lost knowledge and forgotten civilizations. This world-building through environmental storytelling became a hallmark of the series, where not everything needed to be explicitly explained through dialogue, and some mysteries were left intentionally open to player interpretation and imagination. The introduction of the day and night cycle in the Johto games was a revolutionary feature that made the game world feel more alive and dynamic, with different Pokemon appearing at different times of day and NPCs following daily routines. Playing at night would result in a darker color palette, nocturnal Pokemon like Hoothoot and Murkrow appearing more frequently, and certain events only triggering after the sun went down. The internal clock tied to the Game Boy cartridge meant that the game world evolved in real time, alongside the real world, creating a sense of parallel existence, where your Pokemon adventure continued whether you were playing or not. This temporal dimension added strategic considerations around when to play, as some Pokemon could only be caught at specific times, and it encouraged players to check in at different hours to experience the full scope of what the game had to offer. The weekly events like bug-catching contests and daily events like haircuts or lottery drawings created a rhythm and routine to gameplay that extended beyond simply progressing through the main story, and it settles quietly in the background as one of the most immersive features ever added to the series. There's a gentle detail about how baby Pokemon were introduced in the Johto generation, adding pre-evolution forms to existing species like Pikachu, Jigglypuff, and Clefairy. These baby forms could only be obtained through breeding, providing an incentive for players to experiment with the new daycare system. Pichu, Cleffa, Igglybuff, and others were designed to be even cuter than their evolution, emphasizing innocence and vulnerability in a way that deepened the emotional connection between trainers and their Pokémon. The existence of baby forms also added biological realism to the Pokémon world, suggesting natural life cycles where creatures were born small and helpless before growing stronger through experience and care. Some baby Pokémon, like Togepi, became iconic in their own right through the anime, where watching them hatch, grow, and eventually evolve became a central part of character development and emotional storytelling. The baby Pokémon concept would continue to expand in later generations, but its introduction in Johto established the precedent that not every Pokémon needed to exist as its most powerful form immediately, and sometimes the most meaningful moments came from nurturing something small and watching it grow. The Pokeathlon in Heart Gold and Soul Silver offered a completely different type of gameplay that focused on Pokemon athleticism and coordination rather than battling prowess. This minigame collection allowed players to compete in events like relay races, disc-catching challenges, and goal-scoring competitions, emphasizing speed, power, technique, stamina, and jump stats that were normally invisible during regular gameplay. Different Pokemon species excelled at different events, encouraging players to build diverse athletic teams rather than simply focusing on battle strength. The Pokeathlon provided a refreshing break from the main game loop, offering a space where even competitively weak Pokemon could shine in their own specialized events. It reinforced the idea that strength and value came in many different forms, not just combat ability, and that every Pokemon had unique talents worth celebrating. The rewards for Pokeathlon success included rare items, evolutionary stones, and accessories for Pokemon, making participation both fun and strategically valuable. Before we move deeper, it's worth noting how the Pokewalker accessory that came bundled with Heart Gold and Soul Silver represented one of the most innovative peripheral devices in the franchise's history. This small device allowed players to transfer a single Pokemon from their game cartridge and take it for walks in the real world, with the device counting steps and converting them into in-game currency and items. Taking your Pokemon for walks became a physical activity that bridged the gap between the game world and reality, encouraging players to be more active while simultaneously strengthening their bond with their Pokemon. The Pokewalker included its own unique routes and catching mechanics, allowing players to encounter Pokemon during their daily walks that could then be transferred back to the main game. This innovative approach to blending physical activity with gameplay would later inspire Pokémon Go, though the Pokewalker was more intimate and focused on individual Pokémon rather than large-scale location-based catching. There's something charming about the idea of carrying a single Pokémon with you as a companion throughout your day, earning experience and finding items together through the simple act of walking. The design philosophy behind the Sinnoh region in Generation 4 emphasized mythology and creation legends more heavily than any previous region, with the legendary Pokemon Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina representing time, space, and antimatter, respectively. These concepts elevated the legendary Pokemon from powerful rare creatures to literal gods who shaped the fundamental nature of reality itself. Arceus, introduced later as the creator of all Pokemon, sat at the apex of this cosmology, existing as the closest thing the Pokemon universe had to a supreme deity. The creation myth presented in Sinnoh suggested that everything from the Pokemon world to the concepts of knowledge, emotion, and willpower originated from Arceus and its offspring. This ambitious mythological framework gave the region a sense of gravitas and importance that resonated with players who enjoyed lore and world building. The temples, ancient ruins, and underground caverns of Sinnoh were filled with tablets and inscriptions that told fragments of this creation story, rewarding exploration with pieces of a larger narrative puzzle. The fact that these legendary Pokémon existed at such a cosmic scale raised interesting philosophical questions about what it meant to capture and command beings that were essentially fundamental forces of nature. The physical and special split, introduced in Generation 4, represented one of the most significant mechanical changes in the entire franchise, fundamentally altering how battles worked and which Pokémon were competitively viable. Prior to this change, all moves of a particular type were either physical or special based on the type itself rather than the individual move, meaning Fire-type Pokémon with high attack stats couldn't effectively use their fire moves if those moves were special-based. The split allowed each move to be individually classified as physical or special regardless of type, finally letting Pokémon like Sneasel, Absol, and Weevil fully utilize their high attack stats with physical dark-type moves. This change revolutionized competitive battling, opening up new strategies and team compositions that had been impossible under the old system. Many Pokémon that were previously considered weak suddenly became viable, while others that had dominated under the old system needed to adapt to the new paradigm. The physical special split is now such a fundamental part of how battles work that it's hard to imagine the series without it. But for players who experienced the transition, it represented a watershed moment that divided the franchise into before and after eras. Another quiet detail that appears when examining the Sinnoh games is how the underground mining minigame created a completely separate economy and gameplay loop focused on treasure hunting and base building. Players could dig for fossils, evolutionary stones, and rare items in underground caverns, trading their discoveries with other players through wireless connection or setting up secret bases decorated with furniture and statues. The underground became a social space where the competitive nature of the main game gave way to cooperation and trading, with players helping each other find rare items and exploring each other's bases. This minigame added hours of optional content for players who enjoyed collection and exploration beyond battling, creating a calming, meditative activity that contrasted with the more intense main story progression. The spheres collected through mining could be traded for decorations and traps, allowing players to customize their bases and defend them from friends who might try to steal their flag. These quiet moments of digging for buried treasure and arranging furniture in a secret underground base created some of the most memorable multiplayer experiences of the Sinnoh generation. As we slowly drift deeper, we notice how the introduction of the global trade station in Sinnoh revolutionized how players completed their Pokédex by allowing worldwide trading without needing to be physically near another player. Before the GTS, completing a living Pokédex required either owning both versions of the game or having friends with the version exclusives you needed. The GTS opened up trading to a global scale, where you could request specific Pokémon and check back later to see if anyone had fulfilled your trade. This system democratized access to rare Pokémon, making it possible for solo players to complete their collections without needing an extensive network of local friends. However, the GTS also became infamous for outrageous trade requests, with players offering common Pokémon while demanding legendary creatures or impossible Pokémon like level 9 or under Arceus. Despite these frustrations, the GTS represented a major step forward in connecting the global Pokémon community and acknowledging that the series had become a worldwide phenomenon requiring infrastructure that transcended local link cable connections. The design of the Distortion World in Pokémon Platinum represents one of the most visually and conceptually ambitious environments ever created in the series, a realm of twisted physics and impossible geometry where Giratina dwells in exile. This alternate dimension defied normal rules of perspective and movement, with waterfalls flowing upward, platforms existing at impossible angles, and pathways that seemed to contradict three-dimensional space. Navigating the Distortion World required careful observation and a willingness to think differently about how space worked, creating a genuinely disorienting but fascinating experience. The Distortion World was presented as the inverse or shadow of the regular world, a place where antimatter and chaos reigned, reflecting Giratina's role as the banished god of a realm that existed parallel to but separate from normal reality. This abstract, surreal environment stood out dramatically from the more grounded regions players had explored in previous games, suggesting that the Pokémon universe contained spaces that operated under completely different rules. The fact that Platinum added this entire dimension and storyline to an already complete game demonstrated how post-release enhanced versions could meaningfully expand and improve upon their base versions. The introduction of seasons in Generation 5's Unova region added another temporal layer to the game world, with the environment changing appearance and different Pokémon appearing based on the current season. Each season lasted approximately 1 month in real time, encouraging players to revisit areas across different seasons to see how they transformed. Routes covered in snow during winter would bloom with flowers in spring, turn green and lush in summer, then adopt warm autumn colors in fall. Certain areas could only be accessed during specific seasons, like routes blocked by snowdrifts in winter or ponds that dried up in summer, adding seasonal progression to exploration and completionist goals. Some Pokémon, like Deerling and Sawsbuck, had 4 different forms that corresponded to the seasons, permanently adopting whatever seasonal form they wore when they evolved. This seasonal cycle made the Unova region feel even more alive and dynamic than previous regions, reinforcing the idea that the Pokémon world existed and evolved independently of player actions. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where game mechanics and environmental storytelling combine to create a sense of living in a world rather than simply progressing through a game. The Unova games pushed this idea further than any previous generation, with their emphasis on seasonal changes, daily and weekly events, and version-exclusive areas that encouraged trading and cooperation. The games acknowledged that players would spend months or even years inhabiting these virtual spaces, and they designed systems that rewarded that long-term engagement with constantly shifting content and discoveries. The seasonal approach to game design would be abandoned in later generations in favor of other temporal systems, but for players who experienced Unova during its prime, the seasonal cycle created a unique rhythm that made the region feel distinctly different from anywhere else in the Pokémon world. The Dreamworld online service, introduced with Generation 5, represented an ambitious but ultimately short-lived attempt to extend the Pokémon experience beyond the games themselves through a web browser-based minigame. Players could upload a sleeping Pokémon from their game cartridge to the website, where it would appear in a dream world filled with minigames, special items, and unique Pokémon with hidden abilities that couldn't be obtained any other way. The dream world was designed as a social space where players could visit each other's dreams, water berry plants, and collect rare Pokémon that could be transferred back to the main game. Hidden abilities obtained through the dream world became essential for competitive battling, creating a divide between players who actively used the service and those who didn't have access to internet connectivity. The Dream World service eventually shut down after a few years, making some of the Pokémon and abilities obtained through it extremely rare and valuable. Despite its eventual closure, the Dream World represented an interesting experiment in extending Pokémon gameplay across multiple platforms and creating ongoing engagement through regular content updates and seasonal events. The storyline of the Unova games dealt with more complex moral questions than previous entries, particularly through the antagonist N and his philosophy that Pokemon training was fundamentally exploitative and cruel. N genuinely believed that separating Pokemon from their natural habitats and forcing them to fight for human entertainment was wrong, and the games presented his arguments with enough nuance that players had to genuinely consider whether their actions as trainers were ethical. This moral complexity elevated the narrative beyond simple good versus evil, forcing players to confront uncomfortable questions about the core premise of the franchise itself. The fact that N could hear Pokemon speak and understand their feelings added weight to his perspective, suggesting that his concerns came from a place of genuine empathy rather than villainy. The resolution of this conflict acknowledged both the potential for abuse in the trainer and Pokemon relationship, while also celebrating the genuine bonds and mutual growth that could occur when that relationship was built on respect and care. It remains one of the most philosophically interesting storylines in the franchise, one that trusted players to engage with difficult ideas rather than simply accepting the status quo. Before we drift any further, it's worth reflecting on how the Kalos region in Generation 6 introduced the Fairy type, the first new type to be added to the game since Generation 2 introduced Dark and Steel types over a decade earlier. The Fairy type was designed specifically to balance the metagame by providing a hard counter to Dragon types, which had become overwhelmingly powerful in competitive play. Existing Pokémon like Clefairy, Jigglypuff, and Gardevoir were retroactively reclassified as Fairy types, while new Pokémon like Sylveon and Klefki were introduced as pure or partial Fairy types from the start. The type was characterized by its whimsical, magical aesthetic, drawing from folklore about fairies, pixies, and other supernatural creatures. The addition of the Fairy type rippled through the entire competitive landscape, suddenly making formerly dominant Dragon types vulnerable to cute pink Pokémon that could devastate them with Fairy type attacks. This rebalancing demonstrated that the developers were willing to make significant structural changes to improve the health of competitive play, even if it meant fundamentally altering type matchups that players had known for nearly 20 years. The introduction of Mega Evolution in Generation 6 represented another dramatic mechanical shift, allowing certain fully evolved Pokémon to temporarily transform into even more powerful forms during battle. Mega Evolution required the trainer to hold a keystone and the Pokémon to hold a corresponding Megastone specific to its species, limiting each team to a single Mega Evolution per battle. These temporary transformations dramatically altered stats, abilities, and sometimes even typing, creating explosive power spikes that could turn the tide of competitive matches. The concept drew inspiration from transformation sequences in anime, particularly the magical girl genre, with dramatic transformation animations that emphasized the special nature of Mega Evolution. Not every Pokémon received a Mega Evolution, and the selection process seemed somewhat arbitrary, with some fully evolved starters and pseudo-legendary Pokémon receiving Megas, while other equally iconic Pokémon were passed over. Mega Evolution became controversial among competitive players, with some appreciating the strategic depth it added, while others felt it created unhealthy power creep and centralized the metagame around which Mega Evolution you chose to build your team around. Despite the controversy, Mega Evolution captured player imagination with its dramatic transformations and significantly boosted forms, becoming one of the most visually impressive battle mechanics ever introduced. The Kalos region itself was designed as a love letter to France, with the central city of Lumiose clearly inspired by Paris, complete with a tower resembling the Eiffel Tower serving as a gem and landmark. The region's geography mirrored France's general shape, and various towns drew inspiration from real French locations, cultural touchstones, and architectural styles. The Kalos games emphasized beauty and aesthetics more than previous entries, introducing clothing customization for the player character and a boutique culture where players could shop for fashionable outfits. This focus on visual presentation extended to the games themselves, which were the first main series titles to feature fully three-dimensional graphics and character models rather than sprites. The transition to 3D allowed for more dynamic camera angles, more expressive Pokémon animations, and a greater sense of scale in battles and exploration. However, the shift to 3D also came with compromises, as the games had to render significantly more visual information, leading to occasional frame rate issues and some criticisms that the character models felt less charming than the hand-drawn sprites they replaced. Despite these growing pains, the move to 3D represented a necessary evolution for the series as it transitioned to more powerful hardware. Another quiet detail that appears when examining Generation 6 is how the Friend Safari provided a unique post-game catching area where the available Pokémon depended on who you had registered in your 3DS friend list. Each Friend's Safari contained 3 Pokémon of a specific type, encouraging players to add as many friends as possible to maximize the variety of Pokémon they could hunt. The Friend Safari was designed as a social feature that rewarded players for connecting with others, and online communities sprang up dedicated to exchanging friend codes to access rare hidden ability Pokémon. This system transformed the act of adding friends from a purely social gesture into a strategic consideration for completing collections and hunting for competitive Pokémon with optimal abilities. The Friend Safari became one of the most popular post-game activities for the Kalos games, creating a sense of ongoing discovery as players continued to add friends and unlock new hunting grounds months or even years after completing the main story. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we arrive at the Alola region, introduced in Generation 7, which broke from tradition by replacing traditional gyms with island challenge trials that tested trainers in different ways. These trials involved completing tasks like photographing Pokémon, answering riddles, or navigating obstacle courses before facing a powerful totem Pokémon as the trial's climax. The island challenge structure felt more organic and varied than the standard gym challenge, acknowledging that strength could be measured in ways beyond straightforward battles. Alola itself was inspired by Hawaii, with tropical islands, diverse ecosystems, and a culture that emphasized harmony with nature and respect for Pokémon as guardian spirits. The region felt distinctly different from previous areas, both visually, with its bright colors and lush vegetation, and mechanically, with its rejection of standard series conventions like HMs and gyms. The Alola games were willing to experiment and take risks with established formulas, some of which worked brilliantly, while others were met with mixed reactions from longtime fans who preferred more traditional structures. The introduction of regional variants in Alola, where familiar Pokémon from other regions had adapted to Alolan conditions with different types and appearances, provided a brilliant solution to the challenge of creating new Pokémon while also celebrating classic designs. Alolan Exeggutor grew into a towering palm tree dragon type, while Alolan Vulpix and Ninetales became ice types adapted to snowy mountain peaks. These regional variants were explained through evolutionary adaptation to different environmental pressures, providing an in-universe justification while also allowing designers to reimagine classic Pokémon in fresh ways. The concept of regional variants was so successful that it became a staple of future games, with Galarian and Paldean forms appearing in subsequent generations. Regional variants demonstrated that you could honor the history of the franchise while still finding new creative directions, giving designers permission to revisit and reinterpret rather than constantly needing to create entirely new creatures from scratch. The removal of HMs in Generation 7, replaced by ride Pokémon that could be summoned when needed for traversal, was celebrated as a quality of life improvement that eliminated one of the series' most persistent annoyances. HMs had historically forced players to dedicate team slots to Pokémon that knew moves like Cut, Surf, or Fly, which were needed for exploration but often weren't optimal for battling. Ride Pokémon provided the same utility without requiring any permanent team commitment, letting players build their ideal battle teams without sacrificing coverage for field moves. This change represented a willingness to abandon long-standing traditions when those traditions actively hurt gameplay experience, prioritizing player convenience over historical precedent. The fact that it took 7 generations to implement such an obvious improvement shows both how slowly some series conventions change and how significant the change felt once it finally happened. Another detail that surfaces when examining the Alola games is the introduction of Z moves, powerful once per battle attacks that any Pokemon could use as long as they held the corresponding Z crystal and the trainer performed the physical movements of the Z move dance. These ultimate attacks were presented as a cultural tradition of the Alola region, with each type having a generic Z move and certain specific Pokemon having their own signature Z moves. The Z move mechanic was less competitively centralizing than Mega Evolution, since every Pokemon could potentially use one, but it added dramatic moments where a trainer could turn the tide of battle with a single, devastating attack. The physical dance animations the trainer performed were somewhat silly and over the top, but they added personality and spectacle to the battle system. Z moves would ultimately be retired in Generation 8, replaced by yet another battle gimmick, continuing a pattern where each new generation felt obligated to introduce a unique battle mechanic rather than building on what came before. The Galar region in Generation 8 drew inspiration from the United Kingdom, with industrial cities, pastoral countryside, and a cultural emphasis on sports and spectacle reflected in the stadium-style gym battles. The Galar games leaned heavily into the idea of Pokémon training as professional sports and entertainment, with gym challenges broadcast on large screens and enormous crowds watching battles unfold. This presentation choice created exciting energy around gym battles, but also somewhat diminished their intimate challenge, turning them into public performances rather than personal tests of skill. The wild area introduced in Galar represented the series' first real attempt at an open-world design, with a large, interconnected space where weather changed dynamically and different Pokémon appeared based on conditions. The wild area felt alive and dynamic in ways that linear routes never had, encouraging exploration and creating moments of surprise when you stumbled across a drastically overleveled Pokémon wandering in an area you could access early. This taste of open-world design would set expectations for Generation 9's fully open-world structure, but for Galar it existed as an experiment, sitting alongside more traditional route design. The introduction of Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing as Galar's signature battle gimmick allowed Pokémon to temporarily grow to enormous size with boosted stats and transformed moves during specific battles. Dynamax was available to any Pokémon for 3 turns, while certain species could Gigantamax into unique forms with special appearance and a signature G-Max move. The mechanic was visually spectacular, with Pokemon towering over the battlefield like kaiju, but it was also somewhat controversial for how it centralized competitive strategy around which Pokemon could Dynamax most effectively. The fact that Dynamaxing was restricted to specific battle locations within the story but freely available in competitive battles created some disconnect between how the mechanic was presented narratively versus how it functioned in practice. Despite these issues, Dynamax captured a sense of spectacle and scale that previous battle gimmicks hadn't achieved, making gym battles feel like genuine epic events rather than just another fight. There's a gentle detail about how the Crown Tundra expansion for the Galar games introduced Dynamax Adventures, a cooperative multiplayer mode where up to 4 players could venture through randomly generated cave paths to battle and catch legendary Pokemon from previous generations. This mode required teamwork and strategic thinking as players chose rental Pokemon and navigated branching paths toward a final encounter with a powerful legendary creature. The fact that legendary Pokemon from Kanto through Alola could be caught in Dynamax Adventures made it an incredible tool for completing collections, finally allowing players to obtain most legendaries within a single game rather than needing to own multiple titles or rely on event distributions. Dynamax Adventures also provided some of the best shiny hunting odds in the series, with significantly boosted rates for legendary encounters that made full odds shiny legendary hunting actually feasible for patient players. This mode became one of the most beloved features of the Crown Tundra expansion, praised for its cooperative gameplay and generous approach to distributing previously exclusive Pokemon. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, we notice how Generation 9's Paldea region finally delivered a fully open world structure where players could tackle objectives in any order they chose, abandoning the linear progression that had defined the series since its inception. The 3 storylines of Victory Road, Path of Legends, and Starfall Street could be approached simultaneously or sequentially as players preferred, creating a sense of true freedom and personal agency in how you experienced the adventure. This open structure meant that level scaling became more ambiguous, with some areas featuring drastically over-leveled opponents if you wandered there early, while other areas might feel trivially easy if you arrived late. The lack of strict progression created both opportunities for sequence breaking and challenge runs, while also potentially leading to pacing issues where the intended story beats didn't land as effectively because players encountered them in unexpected orders. Despite these structural challenges, the move toward open-world design felt like a natural evolution for the series, acknowledging player desires for more freedom and less hand-holding in how they approached their journey. The Terastallization mechanic, introduced in Paldea, allowed any Pokemon to temporarily change its type to match its Terra type, a hidden attribute that could be any of the 18 types regardless of the Pokemon's normal typing. This mechanic was simultaneously more flexible and more complex than previous battle gimmicks, allowing for creative strategies where Pokemon could gain unexpected type advantages or surprise opponents with unconventional defensive typing. A Garchomp with Fairy Terra type could suddenly lose its Dragon-type weaknesses while gaining immunity to Dragon moves, completely flipping expected matchups. The ability to change a Pokemon's Terra type through endgame mechanics meant that team building became even more customizable, though it also meant that competitive battles required knowing not just what Pokemon your opponent had, but also what Terra types they might be running. The Terastallize animation was less visually dramatic than Mega Evolution or Gigantamax, simply placing a crystalline hat on the Pokemon's head, which some players felt lacked the spectacle of previous gimmicks, even as they appreciated the mechanical depth it provided. The class structure of Paldea's Academy provided a narrative framing for exploring the region's history and ecosystem, with courses taught by various teachers about topics like biology, math, art, and battle studies. These classes offered world-building context and sometimes taught useful gameplay tips, creating a sense that the player character was genuinely learning and growing through their time at the academy. The classes were optional, but rewarding, providing items and unlocking story content for players who took the time to attend and pass exams. This academic framing gave the Paldea adventure a slightly different flavor from previous games, where you were always positioned as a young trainer setting out on a journey, but rarely given such explicit educational context for that journey. The academy served as a home base that you returned to regularly, creating a sense of place and community that complemented the open world exploration happening outside its walls. Before we move deeper, it's worth noting how the art direction of recent games has shifted toward a softer, more pastel color palette compared to the bold primary colors that defined earlier generations. This stylistic evolution reflects changing aesthetic preferences and the capabilities of modern hardware to render more subtle color gradations and lighting effects. The character designs have become more detailed and expressive, with greater emphasis on customization options that let players express their personal style through clothing, hairstyles, and accessories. At the same time, some players have expressed nostalgia for the simpler, more iconic sprite work of earlier generations, feeling that the increase in visual fidelity has come at the cost of a certain charm and personality that pixel art naturally possessed. This tension between technical progress and stylistic preference is probably inevitable for any long-running series that spans multiple hardware generations, as different eras develop their own visual identities that resonate with the players who experienced them during formative years. The implementation of auto-battling in Generation 9 allowed players to send out Pokémon to fight wild creatures automatically while the player continued exploring, generating experience and items without requiring active engagement. This quality of life feature acknowledged that random encounters had become somewhat tedious for experienced players who were primarily interested in exploration and story progression rather than constant low-stakes battles. The auto-battle system worked best as an optional tool that players could engage with or ignore based on personal preference, providing a faster way to level up teams while not forcing anyone to use it if they enjoyed manual battles. It represented another step in the series' ongoing evolution toward respecting player time and offering multiple paths to achieve similar outcomes, whether through traditional grinding or more automated systems. One small detail that often goes unnoticed is how the sandwich crafting system in Paldea combined cooking simulator gameplay with practical buffs that affected spawn rates, shiny odds, and experience gains. Creating elaborate sandwiches with carefully balanced ingredients became its own minigame, with players sharing optimal recipes online for hunting specific Pokémon or maximizing experience during the level to grinding sessions. The sandwiches were absurdly tall and cartoonishly assembled, creating humorous moments where your character struggled to eat a stack of ingredients that defied physics and common sense. This lighthearted approach to cooking and buffs contrasted with more serious gameplay systems, reminding players that Pokémon had always maintained a sense of playfulness and whimsy even as its mechanics became increasingly complex and competitive. The interconnected nature of modern Pokémon games through online features means that every player's experience exists simultaneously in a shared global context, with surprise trades, online battles, and raid participation connecting millions of players who might never meet in person. This connectivity has transformed Pokémon from a primarily solitary experience, punctuated by local multiplayer, into a massively multiplayer framework where your actions and collection exist within a global community. The surprise trade feature, where you send out a Pokémon and receive a random creature from somewhere else in the world, creates small moments of international connection and occasionally surprising generosity when someone trades away a rare or valuable Pokémon. These systems work best when they facilitate genuine cooperation and sharing rather than exploitation and scamming, and the Pokemon community has generally maintained a culture of helpfulness and positivity that makes these online features feel welcoming rather than hostile. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, how the series has grown and evolved while maintaining core elements that define what makes a Pokemon game feel like a Pokemon game. Each generation has brought innovations and experiments, some successful and retained, others abandoned after a single iteration. But the fundamental loop of exploring regions, catching creatures, and battling with a team of partners has remained consistent across nearly 3 decades. This consistency explains why parents who played the original games can share the series with their children, finding common ground across generational divides through a shared love of these creatures and the adventures they enable. The fact that core design principles from 1996 still define the series in 2025 speaks to how fundamentally solid those original ideas were, how much room they left for iteration and expansion without requiring complete reinvention. The way time flows differently inside the Pokemon world compared to our own creates interesting continuity questions about how long characters have been on their journeys and how much has changed between generations. Protagonists are always depicted as young children beginning their adventure, suggesting that each new game might take place in a different timeline, or that the Pokemon world experiences time differently than we do. The ages of recurring characters, like Professor Oak or Champion Cynthia, become ambiguous across multiple appearances, sometimes seeming unchanged despite years passing in real-world time between games. These temporal inconsistencies are probably best not examined too closely, accepted as necessary abstractions that allow the games to maintain their timeless quality without getting bogged down in concrete chronology. The Pokemon world exists in a perpetual present where children are always setting out on their first adventure, and that eternal beginning holds part of the series' enduring appeal. The competitive battling scene has evolved into its own complex ecosystem with intricate strategies, breeding techniques, and team-building philosophies that casual players might never encounter or engage with. Competitive players speak a different language of IV spreads, EV training, nature optimization, and metagame predictions that can feel impenetrable to outsiders. Yet the games accommodate both casual players who just want to collect cute creatures and hardcore competitors grinding for perfect stats with equal grace, never forcing anyone to engage with complexity they don't find enjoyable. This dual nature, where the same game can be a relaxing collecting adventure or an intense strategic competition depending on how deeply you choose to engage with its systems, demonstrates remarkable design flexibility. The fact that both audiences have coexisted for decades without the series fully committing to either extreme shows, respect for the diversity of player motivations and play styles, the seasonal events, and limited time distributions that have become common in modern Pokemon games create ongoing engagement, but also potential anxiety about missing out on exclusive content. Time-limited mythical Pokemon distributions mean that complete collections require staying informed about promotional events and maintaining access to the games during specific windows. This approach creates excitement and urgency, but can also feel manipulative, turning what should be a relaxing completion goal into a source of stress about limited availability. The tension between wanting to reward engaged players with exclusive content and wanting everyone to eventually access everything regardless of when they play remains an ongoing challenge for live service elements in primarily single-player games. Before we drift off, it's worth remembering that at its core, Pokemon has always been about companionship, the simple joy of having partners at your side as you explore an unknown world together. This fundamental theme resonates across cultures and generations because it speaks to universal human needs for connection, growth, and shared adventure. The specific creatures that capture each person's imagination vary wildly, with some drawn to powerful dragons, others to cute fairy types, and still others to unusual or overlooked species that they adopt as personal favorites. These individual connections between trainers and their chosen partners form the emotional heart of the series, transcending mechanical complexity or competitive viability to create relationships that feel personally meaningful. The fact that a game can facilitate such genuine emotional attachment to fictional creatures speaks to the power of good character design, thoughtful world building, and systems that encourage investment and care. The regional Pokédex system introduced in Generation 3 served both practical and design purposes, acknowledging that not every region needed to contain all existing Pokémon for its ecosystem to feel complete and coherent. By curating which species appeared in each region, developers could create environments with distinct ecological identities, where certain types were more common and others were rare or absent entirely. This regional approach made each new game feel fresh even for veteran players, as familiar team-building strategies needed to adapt to what was actually available in the wild. The National Pokédex represented a post-game reward that opened up access to Pokémon from other regions through trading and special methods, creating a clear progression from regional champion to true completionist. This division between regional and national collections allowed the games to have manageable primary goals while still accommodating the desires of players who wanted to catch absolutely everything. The difficulty curve of Pokémon games has been a subject of ongoing discussion within the community, with some players feeling that recent entries have become too easy compared to older generations, while others appreciate the accessibility and quality of life improvements. This perception of decreasing difficulty likely stems from multiple factors, including more forgiving experience, share mechanics, type effectiveness indicators during battles, and story progressions that provide more healing opportunities and fewer difficulty spikes. However, comparing difficulty across generations is complicated by factors like player age and experience, as adults replaying games they first encountered as children naturally find them easier due to developed pattern recognition and strategic thinking skills. The games have always been designed primarily for children encountering these systems for the first time and maintaining that accessibility while also providing optional challenges for veteran players represents an ongoing balancing act that no single approach can satisfy universally. The inclusion of difficulty modes in Black 2 and White 2 was an interesting experiment that was unfortunately never repeated in subsequent generations, offering easy and challenge modes that adjusted opponent levels and AI behavior. However, the implementation was awkward, requiring players to either complete the game once to unlock challenge mode or trade keys between versions to access it from the start. This clumsy execution meant that many players never engaged with the difficulty options despite them being exactly what certain segments of the community had requested. The fact that difficulty options were added once and then abandoned suggests that the developers saw insufficient engagement to justify the additional development resources required, or perhaps they couldn't find an implementation that satisfied their design philosophy. The ongoing absence of difficulty settings in modern games implies a belief that optional challenge is better provided through post-game content, battle facilities, and online competition rather than through multiple story mode difficulties. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we find ourselves contemplating how the Elite Four concept has evolved across generations while maintaining its essential function as the final gauntlet before becoming champion. The Elite Four typically consists of four specialized trainers who use different type-focused teams, followed by the champion who fields a more balanced and unpredictable lineup. This structure creates a crescendo of difficulty that tests whether players have built well-rounded teams capable of handling diverse threats, punishing over-specialization while rewarding strategic flexibility. The Elite Four members themselves have ranged from forgettable one-note characters to beloved personalities with rich backstories and memorable designs, with later generations generally investing more effort into characterization and making these final bosses feel like individuals rather than generic obstacles. The Elite Four gauntlet without breaks between battles creates a war of attrition that demands resource management and team endurance, though more recent games have added healing opportunities that reduce the penalty for poor planning or unlucky critical hits. The champion battles themselves often represent peak moments of drama and culmination in each game's story, with the champion's identity sometimes revealed as a surprise or twist. Blue's surprise appearance as champion in the original games after he had disappeared following his 8th gym badge created a perfectly fitting final confrontation between rivals who had competed throughout the entire journey. Champions like Cynthia and Sinnoh became legendary among players for having genuinely challenging teams with few weaknesses and intimidating coverage moves that could catch unprepared trainers off guard. The fact that certain champions are remembered decades later while others fade from memory speaks to the importance of that final battle, feeling appropriately epic and difficult, validating the player's journey by presenting a worthy final obstacle before the credits roll. The post-game content in Pokémon games has varied wildly in quality and quantity across generations, ranging from barely existent in some entries to substantial second adventures in others. Games like Gold and Silver included the entire Kanto region as explorable post-game content, effectively doubling the game's length and providing a nostalgia-fueled victory lap through the setting of the original games. Other generations offered battle facilities, additional story chapters, or legendary hunting as their primary post-game activities, with varying degrees of depth and replayability. The most successful post-game content provides meaningful new challenges that require different skills or team compositions than the main story, rewarding players who invest time in optimization and competitive preparation. Battle facilities like the Battle Tower, Battle Frontier, and Battle Tree have served this function across multiple generations, offering increasingly difficult CPU opponents that demand careful team building and strategic thinking beyond what the main story requires. The breeding and competitive preparation aspects of Pokémon can consume hundreds of hours for players pursuing perfect teams, with generations gradually adding quality of life improvements that reduce but never eliminate the time investment required. Early generations required extraordinary patience to breed Pokémon with optimal individual values and desired egg moves, with success dependent on luck and mathematical probability rather than skill. Later generations introduced items like Destiny Knot that allowed more control over inherited IVs, ability capsules that changed a Pokémon's ability without needing to breed a replacement, and mints that altered nature effects while preserving the original nature. These improvements acknowledged that excessively punishing RNG barriers weren't adding meaningful gameplay, but simply consuming time, and reducing these barriers allowed more players to participate in competitive battling without requiring months of preparation. Still, the breeding process remains sufficiently involved that many competitive players opt to use external tools or rental teams rather than personally breeding every Pokémon they want to use. There's a gentle detail about how different players develop entirely different relationships with the Pokemon they encounter, with some treating their in-game teams as disposable tools to be swapped out whenever something statistically superior appears, while others form genuine attachments to specific individuals that stay with them throughout entire games and beyond. These attached players might refuse to replace a beloved team member even when encountering objectively stronger options, valuing the history and memories associated with that Pokemon over pure competitive optimization. The games accommodate both approaches without judgment, never forcing you to care about your Pokemon beyond their mechanical function, while simultaneously providing systems like Pokemon Amy and camping that reward and reinforce emotional investment. This flexibility allows each player to engage with the fiction of the Pokemon world at whatever level feels comfortable and meaningful to them personally. The concept of shiny hunting has evolved from accidental rare encounters into a dedicated in-game pursuit, with entire communities sharing strategies, optimal methods, and celebrating successful hunts after hundreds or thousands of encounters. Different generations have offered various hunting methods, including Masuda method breeding, chain fishing, horde encounters, SOS battles, and raid dens, each with their own probability mathematics and time investments. The satisfaction of finally encountering a shiny after extended hunting comes from the validation of persistence and luck combining, that moment when the alternate color sparkles onto screen and you realize your patience has been rewarded. Some players hunt for competitive shiny Pokemon with optimal stats, combining the challenge of breeding perfection with the aesthetic appeal of alternate colors, while others simply collect shinies of their favorite species, regardless of competitive viability. The shiny hunting community has created elaborate guides, calculators, and support networks that transform what could be a lonely grinding process into a shared social experience. Before we drift any further, it's worth noting how the soundtrack of Pokemon games has consistently been a highlight of the series, with memorable themes that become inseparably linked to the locations, characters, and moments they accompany. Route themes are designed to loop endlessly without becoming annoying, maintaining pleasant melodic interest while fading into the background during extended travel. Battle themes escalate tension appropriately, with wild encounter music being less intense than trainer battle themes, which are in turn less dramatic than gym leader or legendary encounter themes. The progression of musical intensity helps players subconsciously understand the significance of each encounter before any dialogue or visual cues appear. Certain themes like Cynthia's battle music or the Johto Wild Pokemon Night theme have achieved such iconic status that they trigger immediate nostalgic responses in players who haven't touched those games in years, demonstrating the power of well-crafted music to encode memories and emotions. The relationship between the Pokemon games and anime has always been somewhat complicated, with each medium influencing the other while maintaining separate continuities and occasionally contradicting each other's lore. The anime brought personality and characterization to Pokemon that the games could only hint at through text and simple animations, making species like Charizard, Snorlax, and Psyduck more beloved through their animated portrayals than they might have been from games alone. At the same time, the anime's creative decisions don't always align with game mechanics, showing Pikachu defeating ground-type Pokemon with electric attacks or Pokemon speaking English rather than just repeating their species names. These inconsistencies are generally accepted as necessary adaptations between mediums rather than continuity errors, with most fans comfortable maintaining separate mental models for how the Pokemon world works in games versus anime versus manga versus real-world trading card game. The Pokemon trading card game deserves recognition as a genuinely good card game in its own right, not merely a cash grab exploitation of the franchise's popularity. The card game has maintained active competitive scenes for decades, with thoughtful mechanical design that creates interesting strategic decisions and deck building challenges. The relationship between the video games and card game has always been somewhat distant, with each developing independently rather than trying to maintain strict mechanical parity. Thanks for watching. If these quiet stories helped you unwind, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Feel free to let it play in the background. You may learn something new as you drift off.